Today I'm speaking with Emily Hedrick. Emily, thank you so much for joining me today.
So glad to be here with you.
Yeah, and this is actually our second time chatting, which is so cool. My honor, my privilege to have you back here. But thank you so much for the first interview. It was called Give Yourself Permission to Trust Yourself as You Deconstruct. That was, wow, like about a year ago. And so
Yeah.
it's so cool to hear your story then. And I'm so glad you're back. But you're one of maybe two or three people that I've had two more than once on the channel. So it's awesome to have you back. And I'm going to have you think of something fun to share in a second, but I'm going to give a quick bio here to get started. Emily lives in Massachusetts, which is one of my states I'd love to see, especially in the fall. But she's a health and wellness coach for compassion fatigue and religious trauma at Emily Hedrick Coaching and Consulting. And there'll be a link beneath this video if you want to go check it out, and some other links to her Facebook page as well. There's some really cool stuff there. She grew up in the Mennonite area of southern Pennsylvania, and that's not too far from where I grew up. And certainly I was involved in a lot of Bible quizzing, so I met a lot of Mennonites. And she grew up in the Mennonite Church USA denomination, which is an evangelical Mennonite denomination there in Pennsylvania. And she went to Goshen College, majoring in Bible, religion, and music. She earned her Master's of Divinity at Wake Forest University School of Divinity, and she subsequently became a pastor in the Mennonite Church. And she has served as a program director for Journey Free, which is so cool, which is, of course, Marlene Winnell's awesome organization. And she's the author of a book called True Confessions of a God Killer, A Postmodern Pilgrim's Progress. And her new book, which is just about to come out, probably about the time that I get this edited and published, it'll be out. It's called How to Treat Your Body Like a Sacred Text. And for anyone that's looking at this interview way after we did it, it is coming out mid-January of 2025. So that's what we're going to discuss in large part today, how to treat your body like a sacred text. Before we jump into what got you started with that book and all that and what's in it, could you just tell us how you're doing, how life's been going, and tell us something else fun about yourself we didn't cover the first time?
Sure. I don't even know what fun things I said the first time, but one of the things that I have picked up on since leaving religion, just very lightly, I'm a music person. You mentioned my music major, and it's really interesting to try and find opportunities to make music without it needing to be about a performance when you're not in a church or religious setting. And I have, within the past few years, discovered the existence of fiddling and specifically started taking Irish fiddle lessons maybe a year or two ago. I might have been doing it when we first talked, and am currently psyching myself up to start going to an Irish pub again, maybe tonight, and continue learning. And so much of it is by ear, and so much of it is with beer in hand. So it's a very different experience than what I grew up in.
That's so cool. I'm jealous. I've kind of got it on my I was gonna say bucket list, but that's not the right way to say it. But one of my next parts of my journey with music is to get back to at least like piano and maybe something else, violin or who knows what. But I write a lot of songs for my kids, just fun songs for them to fall asleep to. And I've always thought I'd love to have an accompaniment of some kind, so it's on my list as well. And in terms of your book, I would love to just hear before we get into it, like what has happened in your life, like how have you been doing, and what has happened in your life between your last book and this one that I'm sure created a context for this to come about.
So much. So the first book I wrote, True Confessions of a God Killer, I wrote most of it when I was 19. It didn't get published until 3 or 4 years later because I went with a publishing company that just needed to take the time. Like there was no money involved. They did it because they believed in the story, and it was a really actually quite empowering experience for me in the progressive religious world. So that book was me trying to explain to people my experience of God as scaring me. And so my journey out of belief wasn't one of, oh no, the facts didn't line up. It was more of a, I believe in God and it's hurting me. I need to stop. So I'm choosing to stop. And that's why I described it as killing God. And as people interacted with me during that time, I was kind of frustrated because they all were assuming it was a doubt problem. And it wasn't a doubt problem, it was a God problem. God was not working for me. And so I wrote the book to explain my experiences. The other piece of that, and I think if you get this out in January, this will be timely because it's Spiritual Abuse Awareness Month. And one of the reasons I wrote that book as an allegory, so that's like it's in story form, it's technically fiction. I wrote that book in allegory form because I was trying to describe spiritual abuse. And it's weird. I don't even want to use the word spiritual violence because it makes me think of, oh, angels and demons and spiritual warfare. And that was not it. It was more of that theological, emotional, spiritual abuse that comes from violent theology that I grew up in and then was starting to experience in more severity in my own internal world when I was in college. So I described some of my experiences in the church in physical terms. So instead of this was a terrible conversation that made me question my sanity, it was this person is strangling me. And I needed that in that book because I did not have words and people around me did not have words. And the exact same story that I put in allegory in chapter maybe 4 of that book is in chapter 1 in its true form in my next book, How to Treat Your Body Like a Sacred Text. So this is me coming back as an adult and a professional and saying, here's what happened according to the research I've been able to do and the training I've been able to do on understanding why that was so significant in my life. And I now have answers I didn't have at that time.
Hmm. It's an amazing journey. It sounds too like, just as I listen to you, I can hear certain keywords and phrases that come up where, like, I love how as you go through this process and you get deeper and deeper into what happened and where you go from here, that you begin to get the language, whether you're coming up with it yourself or you hear it from someone else, you get the language to put to words what you're feeling. And I love how you're describing it as just, it's just so hurtful. It's so painful to have this worldview, whether it's, whatever else we'd say about the mythology behind it, like it's just literally hurting us. And I
Yes.
love just the raw honesty of that. And I think that's something that we all struggle with, is being that honest and just say, this thing, we can dress it up every which way till Sunday and put a ribbon on it, but it's really hurting us. It really is.
Yeah. And that was interesting for me coming into it as a professional and as a pastor. At a certain point, I described it to someone recently as preparing for a Sunday morning sermon often felt like I was detonating a bomb and then putting flowers on it to make it look pretty and saying, look, it won't hurt us anymore. Here it is. And actually, it might be kind of nice. And at least for me, that that's how it felt. And it just did not, it didn't work. It's an interesting thing to go into pastoring, and we covered this in our last video. I was an atheist by then, but I really believed I was doing something worthwhile that was helping people. And by the end of it, because of the systemic issues, the organizational issues, and this major dissonance between what I was experiencing as healing and what the church polity was able to accept lifestyle wise, it just wasn't helping. So, yeah.
Hmm. Well, I love, just to sort of get us kicked off into your actual book, I just want to say I appreciate your choice of title there, How to Treat
Mhm.
Your Body Like a Sacred Text, because one of the things that I've always loved this phraseology, and I'm borrowing it heavily from my time in Christianity, but the idea that your life is a poem, or your life is a song, or your life is a book with many
Mm,
chapters in it. I heard that many times, in the Christian context from people like C.S. Lewis and musicians like Michael Card.
mhm.
And as much as I'm obviously not of the same mindset as them anymore, I appreciate the idea that your life is sort of like a poem or a song or a book. And in many ways, it's an amazing thing to take, number one, to find the words for it, like we said, but also to take back the pen from the invisible author and say, I'm going to write it from this point forward. I'm going to be the author,
Mhm.
and I'm going to take my power back, basically,
Mhm.
and figure out where, where this story went wrong, and make it beautiful. And also to think it's not just another text, as in like a biology textbook or a math textbook. Like this is artistic. This is visceral. This is emotional. This is psychological. This is about trauma and healing, but it's about, on the personal level, it's about you reclaiming your identity and you
Yes.
being able to say, my life is a beautiful story. And even if it hasn't been so far, I'm going to find a way to turn the ugliness into beauty from this point forward. And I love the title you picked, again, How to Treat Your Body Like a Sacred Text. But feel free to, dive into it and take us through what was on your mind as you went through that book and wrote it. Because I love stuff like this. This is my bread and butter, to hear how to take it from just like the generic mythology stuff. Like, I'm personally learning to transform myself. Like, we were, as Christians, everything was be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And it's like, yeah, in a sense, I'm renewing my mind and I am being transformed, but not through the Holy Spirit of the Bible, through actual truth. And it seems like in some ways that's what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So my experience going through grad school to become a pastor, so much of that education is focused on the text and what do we do with the text. And in the Christian tradition, there's this really long history of preaching. And so figuring out a lot of times when you're not the preacher, interacting with the text is about, well, how do I apply this to my life right now? As a preacher, it's expanded to what is the good news for my community that's coming from the intersection of my reading of the text, what's happening in our world, what's happening with the people in my community, and how do I draw that out and offer it to them in a way that they can digest? And so I was taking simultaneously this act of care, which I know for many people, that's not what we've experienced from preachers. Preaching is often the heart of the manipulation of high control religions. It's where the guilt is installed, where we're called to the altar to have this intense cathartic experience that then gets matched with any definitions of spirituality going forward and just feels icky and gross or scary and urgent. And yet, what I learned in my more progressive grad school education was that preaching can be an act of care. It can be about validating and supporting and also calling people out on their shit. And so I wanted to take some of this and translate it into what it would look like for people to interact with their bodies in that kind of a way, because our bodies are constantly giving us messages too. And we have to decide what to do with them. Even if it's, oh, my stomach growled, like I should go get some food. That this is in many ways the good news of that whole little exegesis, which I can define in a second, is there's food here and I get to eat it and it tastes good. um, so, what would it look like, especially for people who have been told by preachers in various different settings in their lives in high control religions, don't listen to your body ever. You need to listen to what I say, to start to reclaim identity and voice. And this is what I think is unique and exciting about my book, know what are some of the mechanics of preparing a sermon? What might a preacher go through to get this done? Guess what? We don't have to keep this a secret. I'm going to tell you about some of that process in my book, and we're going to apply it to how you can use it to find good news, genuinely good news, not like you're damned and now you're saved kind of manipulative story, but rather things that are actually good about being alive. So, yeah, that's a general gist.
That's awesome. Could I ask, could you walk us through like what the main topics or chapter titles are? Like what will we find in the book?
Yeah. So the book is in two parts. The first half is my story. And as I tell my story, it's me saying, and now I understand what happened. Here's some vocabulary. Here's some research. Here's what's going on. So in the first half of the book, you'll hear plenty of stories from my life, some that you might have heard on the internet already and some that are new. And then you'll also see me looking at it through a psychological and neuroscientific lens, with trauma theory in hand. So, one of the things that I talk about in the first two to three chapters are, how do we look at religious trauma as genuine trauma? Are there ways we can categorize this that will encompass not just huge, big, catastrophic events, but also those tiny little things that happen to a nervous system over time in a high control religious community? So I talk about complex trauma, and I also talk about, and I think I'm the only person that I've yet heard frame things in this way, secondary trauma. I think a lot of religious trauma is secondary trauma. The thing that is so dangerous and scary has not literally happened, but your body is prepared for it to happen as if it did in the past. And I think that's how hell works. I think that's how a lot of the doom stories, rapture, tribulation, all of that, none of it has actually happened to any of us. And yet our bodies are prepared to protect us from them as if it did. And that's not a personal primary trauma thing. That's a secondary trauma thing. And once we start to think from that lens, it really does provide a lot of validation for those of us who are like, oh, nothing happened to me. Well, maybe not,
Mm.
but your body's ready to help you out. So,
Reminds me of the stories too of the threat and the fear of like falling into the hands of the living God, as it were,
mm,
where like in Acts it talks about Ananias and Sapphira, and God struck them down right in front of the whole church. And then in First Corinthians, is it where Paul's giving the instruction for how to do the Lord's table, and he says, to come, where you've confessed your sins, otherwise, God might judge you, and he says that's why some of you have fallen asleep. That's sort of the verbiage for, God struck somebody dead because they were
yeah,
taking the Lord's table in vain. And it's interesting to me how just some of these threats, and even those Old Testament things, like when the guy was holding up the Ark of the Covenant, he went to reach out and grab it, make sure it didn't crash down, and God struck him dead. Endless stories like that where you're like, if I make one little presumptuous mistake, God's going to get me. And when you
yep,
weave into that the idea of mind surveillance, where God can see your thoughts, and this isn't just if you slip up, but if you slip up in your head, he knows it and he will get you. And was it James says, "Don't be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, that he'll also reap." And you get this sense that like God's kind of this really loving God, but he's also kind of a mafia boss that'll get you when you don't do it his way. And that is that. I agree. That's a trauma, knowing that you're kind of walking this tightrope of, am I in God's good graces today, or am I about to get whacked?
you just gave me the perfect segue to another topic in my book that I talk about, which is attachment theory. um, and how the way that we're taught to look at God actually puts us in what many psychologists have deemed to be the most terrified category of children in attachment theory. And that would be disorganized attachment. So, one of the things that has helped me understand attachment theory, and I guess I'll give a basic introduction to this, is attachment theory is about how when we are born, we are very vulnerable as infants. We're dependent on our caregivers. And that is a crucial period of time for development and figuring out, what do I need to survive in the world and how do I regard the people around me? And we come out of that with certain ideas that will either help or hinder us when it comes to making relational connections in the future. And the ultimate goal for higher quality of life is going to be secure attachment, that the person that is taking care of us, we trust them, and we believe that we are good enough to be taken care of. And so that creates a worldview of I am good and other people are good too. But there are different ways that that can get messed with. And often we'll discuss insecure attachment as one of those goods is changed. So I might be good, but other people aren't good. That would be the avoidant attachment. Or I'm bad, but other people are good. And that would be anxious attachment. And there have been plenty of books written about this, but we haven't talked as much about disorganized attachment until recently. And that one is the I am bad, other people are bad. Which, when I say it, it's like, well, yeah, this is super familiar. This is the theology for so many high control iterations of Christianity. And what ends up happening with the caregiver in that situation is that they're simultaneously this, I need them because I'm bad and they're there and they have to help me, but also they're bad too and I'm terrified of them. And so this, you're terrifying, I need you, push pull is just constantly there in relationships. And that is exactly what you described with how relationships develop with God, in that paradigm of, you're terrifying because you'll send me to hell. I need you to not be sent to hell. And I need you to take care of the other little quibbles in my life, like whether or not I can find a parking space, depending on how depending on how people define prayer.
Yeah.
So yeah, it really does mess with a person over time.
I was thinking too, as you said the word hell, that from a child's perspective too, there's so many little aspects of that besides just the big one of I'm about to get tortured. But
Hmm.
even just like thinking about the metaphorical idea of, if you were a child literally locked in a closet, and especially if you're somewhat claustrophobic, but you're locked in a small closet, and you can imagine as a child the terror of being told, not just will you go through this, you'll never escape. There's no way out.
Yeah.
Um, that's basically the kind of level that we're talking about, that this God is willing to do to those who don't do it his way and don't believe in Jesus as their savior. And yeah, and then when you think about the separation anxiety of like, I'm going to be separate from my loved ones, my parents, my siblings, everyone that I love, we're all going to be separated in eternity for, again, forever and ever and ever. It's really some of the sickest stuff. And I've been thinking recently about the question of like, why do we call him this good father when it's so clear that he's really psychopathic? But yet we do. And I can easily remember, endless worship services where I sang verses of songs that were like that, where you're this good father. And it baffles me that we don't see it when we're in it. Why do you think, I'm just digressing from your book for a second, but why do you think that we're so willing to call him a good father when he's so clearly psychopathic?
Well, if God is in charge of everything, all powerful, God actually is a caregiver, even if God is a terrifying one. That if everything that exists in the world is coming from God, that means my food, my love, my care, all the things I need to survive are still coming from this terrifying abuser. And if you want to throw more terminology around, the idea of trauma bonding is not the way that most people use it these days of, oh, we're going to bond over our shared trauma. That's not it. Trauma bonding is that when you're in a captivity situation, which, by the way, the second chapter of my book is called The Captor God. So that's where some of this begins to come out. That when a person is in a captivity situation, especially if it's longer term, and the person that is keeping them captive and using violence to do so is also feeding them and clothing them and giving them whatever they need to go to the bathroom or whatever, that this dynamic can occur where they become attached to that person as a caregiver, in addition to them being the source of violence. And super confusing. But if that's where you're getting what you need, then it's survival to continue to be committed to them
Like
until
the
you discover
Stockholm
that.
syndrome stuff.
Yep. Yep.
It's interesting too. I feel like you're touching on a very related topic of the idea of how so much of Christian theology, at least traditional Christian theology, I know progressives take a whole bunch of different routes with this stuff, but
Yeah.
traditional Christian theology is very much teaching you behind the scenes to equate abuse with love.
Yes.
And that is so fascinating to me because it makes me wonder how many of us in life are willing and even trying intentionally to pursue relationships with people who are going to fit a similar paradigm. There's probably a lot of us that are so used to, if I'm in the healthiest, most perfect spot of my life, it's going to be when I'm in a connection of subservience to somebody who is dominating and angry at me, but saying narcissistically, I love you, but you're worthless. But because I'm going to love you, I'm going to make you, redeemable and worthwhile. And no one else would love you, but because of me, you're doing okay. And to equate all of that with your self-worth objectives, but to ultimately say like this, if God is the definition of love, and this is what he does, then we're teaching people from the earliest days to equate abuse with love, to
Yep.
make them one and the same, and to not be able to tell the difference and not be able to see red flags. And then like, should we really be surprised when people make horrible mistakes with a life partner or something? It's like, no kidding, you've already done this on the grandest scale of eternity. Why would we expect you to not do it on this life scale,
Yes. Yes. And that translates into a lot of different situations. One of my regrets from this book is that I did not include some information about my friend that I write about in the introduction. So, in the introduction, I'm leaving the church as a pastor, and I'm comparing some of my experiences with her experiences because she had just moved in with me and my spouse after getting out of an emotionally abusive relationship. And it was a fascinating experience to walk alongside her as she was navigating the manipulation of that and all of the rhetoric that was coming out of, well, he says I'm hurting him and that this is all my fault and maybe I'm a bad person because I didn't love him enough. And I need to fix this by doing what he wants. And there's something wrong with me and it's my fault. And I applied that same rhetoric to my relationship with the church at large of not, while I was able to name violent theology and other things like that, there was still this sense of, well, it's my fault that I burnt out as a pastor, and it's my fault that this isn't working, and it's my fault that I wanted to be a pastor as a woman in the first place, and blah, blah, blah. And comparing those two, the one detail I did not include is that my friend grew up evangelical. And so she has even told me herself at times that there are obvious connections between the patterns of that theology and her experience with an emotionally abusive relationship.
Hmm.
So she gave me permission to include that in the book. So yeah, for the record.
It is staggering. Can I ask, just maybe if I'm jumping ahead, feel free to tell me to, we'll cover this later.
Yeah.
How does treating your body like a sacred text and the whole arena of sexuality and eroticism, how do they overlap? And do you touch on that in the book?
Yeah, I
And just
do.
because that to me
Yeah.
is a big piece of my journey, both so far and hopefully in the future, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Good question. So one of my big breaks with the church was because of growing up in purity culture, being in a denomination that had polity based in purity culture, and then having my first experiences of sexuality at the same time that I was pastoring, and realizing that having secure attachment, which doesn't require sex but can often be experienced through a sexual relationship, is so healing. and and the major contrast between that and this whole religious system that included needing to perform in a certain way for the community, in which I couldn't actually genuinely connect with people because I was too busy performing in order to be safe from like it transferred for me. I got rid of God after the first book, hence the God killing, but it turned into like the captor in my body experience became the community, the church community. And so that major contrast was really a huge part of me reclaiming and saying, I experience everything through my body. If my body doesn't get to be a part of my life, my ethic, my healing, then I'm not part of it. And if you're telling me that I need to completely suppress my embodied experiences to fit your polity, I'm done. What kind of an incarnation is this? So I cover some of that story and how that experience for me. The other piece about body that comes up in that first half of the book for me is the intensity of body shame I experienced growing up as a kid that was not on the correct side of the BMI. And then growing up in the 90s, so add 90s diet culture to that, my response was to dial up my attachment, even as insecure as it was, to God, because I didn't think I was good enough for my peers. And so when that started to shift and I realized there were more options, it really changed my life and my understanding of what was possible.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
It's amazing when you look at, the whole modesty culture and virginity culture and purity culture, how so many of us keep on coming back to the idea that we're seeing ourselves and being treated as commodities. And even in many of these cases, you're sort of groomed as a young girl to be seen as belonging to your daddy. And that at the wedding, you're literally like passing from one man to another, and that you're property. And it's amazing to me how, I don't know what the right word is, but maybe passive, but just you're treated like an object in many ways. And even if, for a lot of people, when you grow up in it, you think it's the most beautiful thing ever and you're proud of it and you want it and you support it and you pass it on to your kids, which is sick. But, when you really get out of it and you can really see it for what it is, and you can pull the curtain back and see the wizard there, and you start to think to yourself, I have been basically not in charge of my own thoughts, not in charge of my own body for so long. I mean, especially if you weave into that anything like you're saying with your journey, where in some ways you're training yourself to not even be safe in your own skin.
Yeah.
But even if you are kind of happy with yourself in some level, to be treated like your body is not your own. And there's even verses that say, for the husband and wife, your body's not your own. You should not deprive each other. And when you look at that, especially when you grew up in it your whole life, and then you deconvert, you're like, I have never been in charge of my thought life and my body in any true sense. And I love how so much of this is about autonomy and reclaiming your authority. And in some ways, it's like waking up for the first time. I love that illustration from the Matrix where Neo wakes up, or he's being, he's been pulled from the Matrix, and he opens his eyes for the first time, and he says, "Why do my eyes hurt?" And they say, "You've never used them before." And then for many of us, we're doing that with our bodies. We're saying, and I think one of the things I'd want to piggyback off of what you said too is I think it's a really hard thing for those of us who grew up in fundamentalist conservative Christianity to really be at ease with eroticism. I mean, we
Hmm.
can be at ease with the idea of, well, if you're in a committed relationship, especially marriage, sex is okay. But this idea of like just the almost the primal urges is like when you realize that you have never let yourself just totally give yourself to your erotic urges, and then it hits you like that's a big part of healing and being a human and embracing my whole body. It's like a whole new world, and you realize you have a lot to unlearn and a lot to relearn. But when you can, and when the context is right to do it, it's such a beautiful part of life to anybody, even as an individual single person, to say, even while I'm still waiting for that to maybe happen someday, to say I can still reprocess this and appreciate the eroticism that's in my mind, whether it's just that exact statement or enjoying fantasies or whatever. But just to be able to say, you can't embrace, you can't treat your body the way it should be if you're kind of running away from your own sexuality. And I don't mean, I'm not talking about homosexuality in that sense, just saying any part of your sexuality. If you're running away from yourself, you're not really at home in your body. And that's a big part of healing, is being at home with yourself.
Yeah, or really any part of being aware that you're in a body at all. I think what often happens for people that need to survive things is that body sensations get suppressed. Of I'm just not going to notice what I'm feeling unless it's extremely painful. And to move from I'm only going to have extreme body sensations come through this major dissociation that I've been using to survive, to let me open myself up to experiences that are not just painful, but also maybe neutral or mundane, let alone like even just small pleasures. Can it feel good to be in a body? Heaven forbid. It feel good to be in a body. And that can go into the erotic, but it can also just be every day, like how much I love the feeling of a warm mug of tea in my hands. And often that just gets pushed to the side. We're kind of heading into the second part of the book here of this is part of learning to read the text, if you will, of the body, of what does it feel like to be here? Can I pay attention to all of these different sensations and start to understand that this is happening to me and build my if you think about working with like the Bible and all of the memory bank of okay, I'm memorizing my scripture. I think some of the embodied ways of doing it, if I treat my body like a sacred text, it's knowing how I feel and what different sensations mean. And that can go from anything like I'm experiencing pleasure to I'm experiencing hunger to uh, all of the different things a body can go through during the day.
Hmm. I love it. I love how you wove the word sacred in there. I know sometimes we all get triggered by the old words we used to use, but
Yeah.
there is a part of this journey where, I mean, I don't want to quite sound woo-woo on this, and I'm probably going to sound woo-woo accidentally, but I don't want to sound crazy, but I'm a nihilist. I don't think any of this matters at the end of the day. I don't think there's any judgment. So ultimately, what you do, whether it's good or bad, it's going to add up to, it's going to just be part of the past, and eventually, no one's going to know our name or what we ever did, and it ultimately won't really matter. But I don't live that way. I
Hmm.
live as if it matters a lot,
Hmm.
and I would say, is my life sacred? No. Sacredness in the sense of the divine or somehow transcendent? No, I don't think there's anything transcendent. But I don't live that way. I live as if it is transcendent. I live as if it is somewhat sacred. I look at my kids and they're incredibly sacred to me.
Hmm.
And it's interesting how it works. But I think in some ways, borrowing from some of the old language that we used to use can still, if we define it correctly, it can still be very helpful. And in many ways, there's a part of us that needs to say a couple things. Number one, you didn't need a savior like Jesus, but you do need a savior. You need to save yourself from
Mhm.
yourself, not from your sin, but from these horrible thoughts that have oppressed you. If you want a shot at actually thriving and living your life, you need to kind of get out of some really bad ideas. And this is a battle in your mind for ideas. And then to say, if you really want to thrive, you have to find a way to love yourself. And if you can't break through that, if you can't love yourself, including your body and your mind, then you're never really at home. And so many of us, I think we realize as we deconvert and at least deconstruct that we're struggling with the fact that we do not feel safe, whether it's our body or just our thoughts. We feel like we are constantly in some ways oppressing ourselves. And it's such a cool thing when you realize I have been on the wrong side of myself for too long. I have been literally my own worst enemy. And yes, I've been fed, spoon fed these ideas, and you can call it, well, I'm fighting, but it's really indoctrination that's fighting me. But at a certain point, you got to take responsibility for your own thoughts and to say, despite what I was taught, it's now time for me to decide what do I really want to believe and what's my worldview. And at a
Mhm.
certain point, it's such a cool thing to say, from this point on, it is going to be sacred. Not like I used to use that word, but it is going to be sacred. It is going to be transcendent. It's going to be a goddamn beautiful life because I'm going to make it that way. But I've got to make specific choices to get there. It's so cool.
Yeah.
I love how you wove that in.
Yeah. I was just thinking as you were talking about this, and this is an idea I'm playing with, so take or leave it. I might disagree with myself later that nihilism is a canvas on which we paint our meaning onto. I think it's not to say that there is any one true meaning to life, but rather the meaning that I choose to create with what I've got. And I think that makes life worth living, at least for me. The creative, expressive in me is like, yeah, I'm here to make stuff. Let's go. And so I appreciate how, as people get out of those high control religions that say, here's your meaning, eat it, um, that we can claim our own autonomy and say, I'm going to make something I like. That doesn't smell good. You know, watch me mix 50 metaphors here. But the other thing that you mentioned was that we've learned over time to be so scared. And I think that goes really well into another portion of the book that I talk about the exegetical process, which I define as making meaning out of the text. And this is a humble process because I think a lot of times when fundamentalists approach scripture and say there's one plain way to read scripture, they're just wrong. They're not truly respecting the text. And I think that's similar when it comes to our bodies. And that's one of the pieces of humility we need to bring to working with our bodies as a sacred text. And when we do trauma work, is that just because I feel afraid doesn't mean that I'm in danger. And that is a bit mind blowing initially when interacting with it, but is a key piece of recovery of starting to say, let me look at the historical context of some of these sensations I'm experiencing. Is there a reason that the thought of pleasure in my body is terrifying to me? And could it be that I could experience pleasure and be safe, despite what has happened in the past, despite what my body has prepared to protect me from? And so that's also part of working with our bodies as a sacred text, of recognizing, hey, we don't need to take them literally all the time. There's an interpretation process for every sensation if we want to engage in that.
Hmm. It's fascinating stuff. I was curious, when you think about treating your body like a sacred text, one of the sort of parallel things that comes to my mind is the idea of an actual book, a text that you would write and that you would give a title to.
Hmm.
And it makes me think sort of similar to the words you might have inscribed on a tombstone. Like, what was your life about? Or what, this on this side of death, like, what do you want the rest of your life to mean? If
Hmm.
you were to call your life and your body a text and you were to call it a book, what title would you give it?
Oh, wow. Good question.
I put you on the spot, I know.
Yeah, like there's a part of me that's saying, well, what's most personal is most universal, so I'm going to give you something that's kind of vague and universally, but it'll apply to all of us. So I don't know if it'll be uniquely about my life, but I think it's actually kind of getting to where I'm headed with this, which is I am whole and part of a whole. Um,
Mm,
so this idea, one of the pieces of trauma recovery that I've found is doing exactly what you say, of claiming what matters to me and what am I here to do. And the thing that keeps coming out on top for me is connection. I think human connection is one of the most potent forces in the world, but I also think it's worth recognizing our connection beyond just humanity as well. And that exploring that and reveling in it and enjoying it, it makes life worth living. And that's what I want to do with my time.
mm.
So, yeah,
I
I am
love it.
whole and part of a whole, both.
Mm. I love it. I think it's interesting when you're speaking. You made me think of the phrase that I've heard of used a few times of being kind to yourself.
Mm,
And when you use the word whole, thinking about like how do you get there? How do you get to be whole? And for a lot of us, I think it really does amount to being able to, like we said, transform our thoughts about ourselves, but specifically to love ourselves and to be kind to ourselves. And that the more that you do that, the more that you really do, like if you were to think about if you were a Christian and you had like some ancient manuscript, let's say it's from the year 500 or something, you're like, wow, this is really precious. Like I shouldn't touch it without gloves. You're like, I'm going to treat this with care. And I'm
yes.
going to
Yeah.
put it, if I'm even allowed to touch it, I'm going to put it back in its case and, with the, slightest movements, and I'm not going to mess it up. It's so critical. And to treat yourself that same way and say, I'm going to be kind to myself. And it's really interesting when you weave in the one side of the messaging we got, which says, don't ever trust yourself, lean not
Mm,
on your understanding. Your understanding is so bad. Don't listen to yourself. You have only thoughts that are depraved and prideful and unwise and sinful. And then also you weave in you're worthless and you're right, your best is like a filthy rag. You put those things together for so many years, and it's like you have this internal voice. And I think about internal voice a lot because I've got four small children, and I'm aware that what I say to them becomes part of their internal voice. So
mm,
I have to like catch myself, like, do you really want to, like, be careful how you phrase this, because this could be part of their internal voice. And I catch myself all the time trying to be careful about how I'm doing things because I don't want them to ever have something that becomes part of their internal permanent voice that's actually like self-harming. And in a similar way, I think a lot of us need to sort of reparent ourselves in that sense and say, you have an internal voice and you're not going to be able to heal from the bad ideas until you can identify, like, what is it? What am I saying to myself? What have I been saying to myself? And then of course, this, if as we need to switch the narrative. And also just as a, if I can keep using the metaphor of this text, like if this was just in a museum and 1,000 people had seen it before you, you'd be like, oh, it's interesting, but it's not new. But like if you were an archaeologist and you just dug up the next lot of Dead Sea Scrolls, like holy shit, like the last group, they found all these pots full of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but if they would have dug down another 200 feet, there's like 1,000 more of them, and they're really cool. And like this is this whole new discovery, and it changes everything yet again. And it's almost like you have to treat yourself like you're seeing yourself through fresh eyes and be like,
mhm,
how would I see myself if none of this garbage had been there as my filter? How would I interpret myself through just fresh, sort of, clean slate eyes, as it were? And it's like an invitation to say, well, you can't really do that, can you? No, but you can still begin to reprogram your internal voice as if you're treating yourself that way. And again, reparent yourself, as it were. But it's such a beautiful thing. And I love the idea of celebrating yourself. Like when I was growing up, and the purity culture was always, stop masturbating and stop lusting. But to be able to say, you know, what if instead of all that messaging, you said, why don't you just celebrate yourself? Really celebrate. You think about sex nonstop, celebrate it. That's who you are. That's great. And I fought that my whole life. And it's
mhm.
such a cool journey on this side of it to say, you know what, Tim, you think about sex all the time. That's great. That's who you are. That's an awesome thing. And I think all of us are, it's going to come out in different ways. but to just figure out who are you, what makes you dance inside, and then party it up, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think the heart of what you're getting at here is this good news of figuring out, like, I recognize good news is a very Christianized term at this point, but I am here for reclaiming it because the concept of good news is pretty basic. And I I really encourage people to, I mean, in general, trauma recovery is actually about good news because we can't recover from trauma if we're still in the crisis that caused it. So, trauma recovery is about saying, hey, we survived, we made it. Whatever we did to get through that thing worked. Awesome. Now let's celebrate where we are. And so, as I continue to work through the book, it turns into this sermon prep process of saying, what is your good news? What are you preaching? And you get to be the preacher now. You don't have to listen to someone else tell you how terrible you are or what you have to do in order to be safe. You get to decide. This is your voice. This is your good news. And being able to go beyond just, I want to feel safe, to, I know that I am safe and I know that there are good things in this world and I am going to embrace them. And one of those good things is me. That's just that's that's the stuff that I get excited about.
I love it. I was thinking when you said that, one of the things that I do occasionally, I don't do it admittedly anywhere near enough, but every once in a while, I love to just kind of talk to myself, as it were, and say, like, what are you really feeling? What are you really thinking? And in that
Mm,
process, I've learned to literally spend time just staring at my own eyes in the mirror and to just like for a long time, quietly stare at your own eyes and get brutally honest. Where are you? Not
mm,
just talking out loud as you're fiddling with other things. There's fiddling again. As you're doing other things, but like actually like focus, take deep breaths, stare at yourself in your own eyes in the mirror and say, what in the world is going on in your head right now? And sometimes it doesn't mean that much, but sometimes it gets very real and very honest to me. And
mm,
I appreciate that. I wish I could, say I was, always honest with myself. I think some of us are not, are we're struggling at times with being honest with ourselves. Like, where are you? And I'm like, we all have these sort of masks that we wear even to ourselves to say, no, I'm fine. You're fine. You're fine. I remember one of the, if I could add this real quick, one of the biggest differentiations that I've always it's meant the world to me to hear this differentiation. When I was in mission school, they said to all of us who were there preparing to do like Bible translation in a jungle environment, they said, you all need to get one big thing straight before you do anything else: belief versus worldview. And I would have probably kind of equated them as the same. They said, no, beliefs are what you can articulate. And worldview is what you probably can't articulate, but what you actually believe for real.
mm,
And I thought about that. I mean, they expounded on it exponentially for months, but in different ways. But I thought about it a lot, how that comes out, I think, in counseling sessions, where you could say, for example, to a Christian, are you are you valuable? Are you worth do you feel like you've got worth? Be like, of course I do. I'm a child of the king. I've been redeemed. Of course I do. But if you ask the right, and I say this as someone who I can literally say I've gone through this. I had this piano teacher who at one point, just a lovely man, real short man with these little beady glasses, and he could have canceled the class at the beginning of the semester and said, "There's only you're the only one that signed up. I prefer to have at least 2 or 3 students. You're the only one." But he's like, "No, I'll meet with just you one on one." And we met one on one for the whole semester. Just this lovely man and Mr. Foster. And Mr. Foster, at one point, we started this piano class, and he said, "Put your book away. Let's turn your piano off. Let's talk." And we talked, and we went through a few questions. And at one point, he got real quiet and he said, "Tim, you feel absolutely worthless, don't you?" And I mean to tell you, I could have said my beliefs at that time were, "Of course not. I'm a child of the king." And the truth came bawling out of my eyes.
mm,
And it was just one of those seasons of life where it was absurdly true that I felt worthless. And it's just, I think that kind of dynamic of saying, not what do you believe, but what do you really believe? And finding the words, we started with that idea, finding the words to say, what do you really think about yourself? And I love the idea of being able to say, you know what, I'm confident at last that I have undone some of the damage that this worldview has done to me. and I'm reclaiming myself. And if everybody else, if all the Christians say you're the fool who said in his heart, there's no God, you're a fool for leaving. If God in his book says you're deserving of punishment, if no one else will praise me, I will be my cheerleader from this point on. And I think a
Mm,
lot of us struggle with that. A lot of us
yeah,
really do, but
yeah,
it's a place to start healing.
yeah. And this internal sense of validation is a major, major factor in resilience. If we're constantly looking for other people to tell us that we're okay or that we're worth something, we're at their mercy. And yes, I think it's worth acknowledging that we're social creatures and it is really important to have that community of care. And also, part of being able to weather stuff is having that internal compass, that internal awareness of this is who I know myself to be. And this is what I can celebrate about myself, even in the moments when no one else can.
In terms of your actual personal journey with not just writing the book, but actually living it, could you maybe talk us through what are some of the biggest challenges that you've faced in treating your body like a sacred text? And then also, what are some of the biggest victories you've had as you've been successful?
Yeah. I mean, some of it is just the learning curve. I had not been used to listening to my body. I had a little, I had a little span in div school because we did talk about bodies a fair amount in divinity school. Yay, progressive graduate school education. But by the time that I got to pastoring, it was just like, I'm not safe here. Therefore, my body has nothing to say to me that I can use in this moment. I'm running from the bear. Thank you. And so once I initially started trying to listen, it all sounded like gibberish to me. It's one of those things that you start to notice all of these little sensations. It's like, oh well, what's that? What's that? What's that mean? What's that mean? And so getting used to, okay, no, this is all still here. I get to decide what I want to interpret in any given moment. That's been part of my journey of just figuring out where am I going to give weight, and also I need to give myself permission to not be good at this all the time because I won't be. I'm still learning. I will continue to learn forever. Some of the bigger wins for me have been in learning relaxation practices that can be done quickly. So 5 to 10 seconds. This is something that I talk about later in the book of if you want to preach good news to your body, you have to do it in your body's language. And that's not going to be verbal. Like our bodies our nervous systems get conditioned from these sensory experiences touch, taste, feel, smell, hear. That's the stuff that matters more so than a particular thoughts. Thoughts are so much slower than all of those other senses. And when I am able to relax my body in the face of something that used to be a threat but isn't anymore, that is the good news of, hey, you made it, you survived, we got through. And so there have been moments where I've been majorly activated, super anxious, think the whole world's going to end, or more likely, my version of anxiety is there's something terribly wrong with me and I'm hurting people. Those tend to be the big ones that show up for me. And when I am able to use acute relaxation practices that I can have happen in 5 to 10 seconds, I can shift into a completely different body state that is literally that felt sense of safety of, no, there's nothing wrong with me and I am not hurting anyone right now. And to be able to have that felt body sense, it's amazing. There have been a few times when most of the time it's very mundane, but there have been a few times when it's been dramatic to the point that I've been obsessing about something and about to spiral really badly, if not in the middle of it, and have been able to shift over through relaxation and actually focusing on things that I find pleasurable. So there was one particular moment when it was my birthday, actually. It was my birthday a year or two ago. And you know how birthdays can make everything worse because if you have a bad day on your birthday, it's a bad day on your birthday as opposed to a bad day on any other day of the year. It's like one of the reasons why the holidays are also really hard. Um, and the way that I was able to bring myself back was through something that I talk about a little bit in the book, pelvic floor relaxation, and staring out the window into the woods and looking at the snow and saying, isn't it so pretty? Pelvic floor relaxation. Isn't it so pretty? Deep, deep breath. Isn't it so pretty? And eventually got my body back into a different state. And then asked myself, so that thing you were worried about, do we need to do anything about it? And I was just like, no, I'm fine, actually. Everything's fine. And the fact that that shift could happen in about 30 seconds was just like, wow, I am learning so much about how to actually communicate with my body about what's happening. And that's a really big deal. So, yeah.
Hmm. In terms of the looking forward, if you were to, be looking at different aspects of how you would treat your body as a sacred text, and if you had a whole list of different arenas and you're ranging them, from 1 to 10, 10 being, you're thriving. If some of those areas were not coming up as tens, you had some seven, eight, nines in there. What would you say is sort of your path forward for areas where you've maybe tried, but you're not finding success? Like when you feel like you're aware of issues and places where you want to grow and be more safe, but it's just not happening. What would you say to yourself or to someone listening that's like, I, I I'm just not successful. Like something's not clicking here. And I
Mm.
know, the obvious one of like you might want to consider a therapist, but just like beyond that one, is there anything else you would encourage from your journey, especially where some part of it's been exceptionally hard?
Yeah. So, my big go tos in those moments are connection. So, one of the things that makes therapists so magical is that they can offer, or scientific, whatever you want to say, is that they can offer presence in a way that other people in your life might not be able to. But if you have trusted friends, you can get that same kind of regulating capacity with another human. If my nervous system is on the fritz, I go find someone I trust because I know their body can help my body in a way that I can't communicate with my body right now. Other bodies can speak good news to my body just by being in their own felt sense of safety while I'm freaking out. The other piece of that actually is to go to beautiful places outside. I can't necessarily claim the science behind that, but I know it's there. I just haven't personally done the specific research for it. But I do think that there is something about beautiful places in nature that can reset a body from a certain state. And the other thing that I just continue to encourage with people overall is to keep building the foundations of your own support system and routine. Have stuff there where you made decisions for yourself before you were in crisis. Go to that yoga class weekly and do it whether you're in the mood or not, so that the next time you're freaking out and it's time to go to yoga, you go to yoga. Have the humans that you go to the gym with. And like one of the things I did for myself most recently was I started going to the gym regularly with a friend. And I did it strategically because I tend to get into shutdown a lot as a trauma response. And I am in shutdown probably, I don't know, I still think at least 50% of the time. And that's okay. We go by percentages, not by binaries when it comes to recovery. And so the two big things to get out of shutdown are connection via other humans and movement. And so I made a point to say, I need to find another human to move with. I don't need to do anything fancy at the gym. I just need to like walk with someone there. And I need it to be on a schedule and I need it to be routinized so that I can just do it without thinking, that I don't have to make decisions. And I had a friend that I went to the gym with the night of the election and the morning after the election. I didn't plan that self-care. It was already there. And I'm really glad I did. So,
Mm,
yeah, that was a
yeah,
little long-winded, but
well said. It's a
yeah.
good reminder too, I think, to where you're talking about the connection and the other people for those of us who are looking at it from the perspective of not just each of our own individual journeys, but also the journey of the people that we love, to really say, we have a calling, as it were, to really bless people. I know it was a big part of our Christian journey to bless the world, as it were, through Jesus. Like, what a privilege to look at someone and say, especially if you're in a relationship with them or their family, to say, like, I see your journey and respect it. Like, I acknowledge it, I affirm it that you're struggling. And especially, I think, in a relationship context, to say to somebody, you're safe with me. Like, number one, your autonomy is safe with me, and your need for space at times is safe with me. But your journey and your pain and your tears, like, I want to be the shoulder you cry on, and I want to tell you, that it's okay to not be okay sometimes, and that this is a journey, like you just said, and that you don't have to measure up in some to some arbitrary thing. Like we can just take it one day at a time, and to still treat each other as beautiful creatures, even though we're beautifully, you know, uh, flawed, as it were, or beautifully wounded. Like we're still art. It's like I think of ourselves as living art. It's like just
Yeah.
because your art isn't quite looking the way you want it to yet. And number one, it's not done. You can add more strokes and paint to it. Your art's not done yet. Your poetry, there's more stanzas you can add to the poetry, and you can change the tune. But to say if it's not sounding right today, like that's okay. But just to have someone to walk through it, and if I think just I say this sort of tongue in cheek, but like if you can't find someone that's safe to be with, at least find a good dog.
That
Sometimes
no, legit. Legit. It's a real thing. They have nervous systems too. Yeah. Yep.
it's amazing. Well, in terms of maybe bringing us to a wrap up, could you tell us, number one, anything else that's on your mind from that book that we didn't get to that I didn't ask about? And also, sort of, if you have to predict where the next step of your journey is going, whether it's an actual book or just the next project, like what's next on your agenda, or is this just time to sort of bask in the current book for a while?
Yeah, okay. So the one thing I didn't talk about that does feature in the book a little bit is grief. One of the things that is part of reconnecting with a body and allowing good news to be a part of things is the good news of it's safe to grieve. Doesn't mean that the thing I'm grieving is necessarily good news, but the fact that I can safely grieve, that someone's not going to emotionally manipulate me while I'm vulnerable because of letting go of a loss or whatever that happens to be. That's a huge part of growing and being alive as a human. It is also part of recovery, but like grief is universal to the human experience, whether you have religious trauma or not. So I'm putting in a plug for celebrating grief, if you will. And as far as what's coming next for me, I am wanting to start. I'm not wanting to start, I'm doing it. In March, I am starting a program for anybody that is looking to delve deeper into these practices in a structure or rhythm with other humans that can give them that container to get things going for themselves in their journey. And so that
Nice.
that program is called My Body, My Text. It's 3 months and it's a mix of group meetings, individual meetings with me, and some educational stuff as part of all of that. So it's a mix of learning skills, of figuring out, yeah, what is my good news and what matters to me, what am I painting on my nihilism canvas? And then also doing that with other people who get it, because that connection is just pivotal.
Mm.
So, yeah.
I had a bit of a Freudian slip in my ear when you said group meetings. I thought you said group beatings. I was like,
Oh
oh no.
no. No. I mean, even if I wanted to, I couldn't. It's online.
Exactly. Well, I love it. I love what you're doing. It feels like this is also just a way of bringing it back to the idea of you know life's beautiful.
Mhm.
Life is really beautiful, and this is time to write your poetry. It's time to get your text and to write it how you want it. And I think it's so cool. What would you if you did have to write a next book? What would be
Mm.
your best guess for a title, or at least a topic?
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is post traumatic growth. And I would love to gather a collection of stories of the different domains of post traumatic growth from other religious trauma survivors, because I
Hmm.
think there's good stuff happening as a result of us choosing to recover. And I'm curious about that.
When you refer to us, are you referring to the deconstructing community or just culture in general?
Deconstructing community, as in anybody that has experienced high control or toxic religion and has gotten out and is on their own journey to reclaim themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't usually like to turn my interviews to politics, of course, because it's not what this is about, but I have to just make a quick plug and say it feels like some of the things you're saying are going to be very, very, very applicable to a lot of people's personal journeys psychologically and so forth over the next 4 years, because it is about to hit the fan, and despite our best efforts against it, and it almost feels like how to treat your nation like a sacred text. And it almost feels like we're gluttons for punishment at this point, and it feels like we're going to get to do a lot of healing on a lot of levels, both personally and in our groups, as well as hopefully someday in our nation. But it's a fascinating journey.
It's actually quite curious to me. One of the big experiences I had after the election, I live in Massachusetts. I very occasionally attend a UU church. And while I was there at a potluck and we were talking politics before the election, I mentioned people I knew that voted for Trump. And they were like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know anybody that voted for him. And I had this moment of, oh my goodness, we don't know each other. The polarization, I knew we all know we're polarized, but there is this question of which, we're proof texting a bit. If you want to treat our nation like a sacred text, we are all proof texting quite a lot, and starting to bring back some discipline to figure out, wait, what all's included in this text? What are the things that I haven't been paying attention to in order to get a clear picture of what's going on here? That's something I've been asking myself a lot
Hmm.
for the past month or so, 3 months.
It's fascinating to part of our journey here. Hoping for better days ahead. But and well, thank you so much. This has been so good to hear your story. And can I just maybe ask, just bring it real personal? How are you doing? How have you been doing with all this?
It is very scary to publish a book this straightforward. True Confessions of a God Killer was easy because it was all allegory. I'm sure I might be dishonest in that. I don't fully remember. But this book, when I first turned the draft in, I was sick multiple times in the next month. And it was my body kind of saying, hey, let me keep you safe and make sure that you're sick and you're worth more when you're sick because people will take care of you and that kind of stuff. And this very let me protect you. Bad things will happen because you decided to be honest this way. So I've been managing. I've been managing the bad news. I have been living with my whole life with some of the good news of, hey, you can do this, and this may actually be as helpful to other people as it was to you to create it. So, yeah, it's a balancing act.
Well, I know that in many ways the healing is often happening for a lot of us when we let ourselves relinquish any desire for affirmation from other people. Like we just only affirm ourselves to drown out the other voices. But I do hope that that our community will rally around you, and as much as I wouldn't want anybody to rely on someone else's applause or lack thereof for their well-being. I do hope that people will come around you and rally and just say thank you for doing this, thank you for being willing to be so honest. Because one of the things I'm really focusing on in my journey personally, as well as my channel, is the idea that this journey is so much of it is psychology, so
Mhm.
much of it is understanding what's been done to us in order to understand how to undo it and how to take the next steps forward. And in so many ways, this is about indoctrination. It's about psychological child abuse. It's about manipulation. It's about propaganda. And there's so much to unpack. There's so much to unravel. And the
Yeah.
fact that people like you are willing to kind of walk us step by step through some of those things it's an amazing thing. I appreciate it so much. I hope our community will rally around you and just say thank you for being part of this, because we need it. We need it for sure.
My hope is that it is a source of connection for people, connection with themselves, and connection with each other, and connection with me because I like connection. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I know I need to wrap up here, but I just wanted to say thank you again so much for sharing your journey. And again, I'll have some links beneath this video. Number one, for our earlier interview a year ago, as well as for her religious trauma coaching and consulting there, and some other links. But please also check out her book. I'll have the link for Amazon as soon as it's available. Please go buy it, subscribe, and support her in every which way, because this is the kind of stuff that we want to put on blast, and we want as much of it as we can. So please do support Emily. But Emily, thank you so much. Great to get to know you through
So
this whole long process the last couple of years. And also thank you for what you're doing right now. And I look forward to doing it again. I definitely, let me know when you write the next book. We're going to do the third interview.
okay, sounds good.
Thank you so much, Emily. Have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.